So, Godzilla and Kong, The New Empire just came out, but these are characters that have been around for generations. So, it'll take a little while, but let's catch up on how we got to where we are today. It's time for another franchise mega review. Now, the character of King Kong first came to the screen in 1933 with the famous film of the same name. In an era before CGI and live action hybrids were a routine thing, stop motion animation was used. The unavoidable side effect, of course, was that the motion would be somewhat jerky, and also because this character had fur all over its body, anytime that character was manipulated, which was for every different frame, those areas on the fur would be matted or moved or changed, but this was amazing for the time. Now, what struck me early on was the use of the phrase "good Lord" in a casual sense. Seemed a little sacrilegious, but it turned out this was a pre-code movie. And that can be seen further on with surprisingly graphic for the time violence, which was a little surprising for me, especially for an older film, because this stuff was, of course, dialed back in the coming decades. This was a sweeping epic that took place on Kong's island home with people that kept him in his enclosed area, but also kind of worshipped him, and going all the way to the city. And of course, we know the famous conclusion.
Ladies and gentlemen, look at Kong, the eighth wonder of the world.
The airplane's got him.
Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast.
Now, interestingly, something that's routine today, namely cash grab sequels due to popularity, was done then too. That same year, 1933, they pushed out a sequel, Son of Kong, which was far weaker by comparison. It was also somewhat cuter, more cartoonish. But that was it for over the next 2 decades. So now moving on to a completely unrelated franchise, Godzilla. The first one in that series came in 1954. From a perspective of being more familiar with Jurassic Park, I noticed how Godzilla's roar seemed to have influenced that.
私は見た。確かにジュラ紀の生物だ。どこですか?
original Godzilla also was meant to be a little bit more thoughtful, have a little more depth to it. It was also to have allegory, like with regards to fooling around with nature, and also the atomic bomb, which was also bigger on people's minds at the time. Someone in the movie even made the comment, "I barely escaped the atomic bomb in Nagasaki, and now this." Now, an interesting thing with this movie, it was made for Japan. However, they made a special American version. They cast an American actor, Raymond Burr, to be the star power to attract an American audience. They used the footage from the Japanese version, have him narrating it, had scenes inserted throughout to make him a part of the story. So it's interesting to kind of watch both versions, because they're like two different movies almost, from two different angles of two different viewpoints of the same story. It's really an interesting concept.
A prehistoric monster the Japanese call Godzilla has just walked out of Tokyo Bay. He's as tall as a 30-story building. Now he's making his way toward the city's main line of defense. I can hardly believe what has just happened. Now it seems Tokyo has no defense.
Now, the next year there was Godzilla Raids Again, and the alternate title was Gigantus the Fire Monster, perhaps because Godzilla actually died at the end of the very first movie, and he was even shown being a skeleton. This fact was later kind of glossed over and even outright ignored later, and this was actually an early example of shared universe. Like Universal had done it with their monsters and had crossovers. Actually, in the very original Godzilla movie, when the scientist was testifying, he mentioned a snowman monster. And actually, the company that made these movies, Toho, their next movie, also in 1955, was Half Human. And that was about this abominable monster in northern Japan. And Toho would continue to make these other monster movies that were basically standalone movies, but they would go on to be linked in this shared universe with Godzilla. Monsters such as Rodan, Mothra, and more.
Thank you so much.
And a lot of these continued the custom of having a separate version made for American audiences, not only with dubs but also some changes. But now we get back to King Kong, because bizarrely, in 1962, they brought him into the franchise. King Kong versus Godzilla. In this movie, Godzilla is inexplicably in an iceberg. And also, interestingly, they start showing his blue glowing spines on his back. Now, as for Kong, of course, this is a completely different continuity than the two original King Kong movies from 1933. Totally different. Kong not only looks completely different, but of course he didn't get off the island and go to New York and die, obviously. He's also the same size as Godzilla now. And they didn't use a stop-motion puppet. He's a person in a costume. And by now, of course, it goes without saying, the franchise was just a continuous source of random stories. It basically like a kid having pretend with toys. and there happened to be a camera rolling. This was far removed from the original Godzilla and Kong movies, which at least tried to provide some semblance of narrative or seriousness. But by now they're just spitting these things out. It very much had a Power Rangers vibe to it. And they would go on to do other team-ups or versus, Mothra versus Godzilla, a bunch of others. And the concept was now in place of some of these being protectors, or more accurately, perhaps weapons against other threats. So for instance, while Godzilla was destructive, he was sort of like the lesser of two evils, and he was looked to as this force of nature who would counteract other more destructive forces. By 1967, there was Son of Godzilla, who hatched out of an egg, and he teaches him the ropes. After that animated series, interestingly, Toho made their only standalone King Kong film called King Kong Escapes. And this live-action movie took up the concepts from this animated series. Concepts such as King Kong facing off against Mechani-Kong, and also a villain named Doctor Who, no relation to the other series. And then they had sort of their Avengers moment of this early MonsterVerse with the movie Destroy All Monsters, which takes place in the year 1999. World peace was achieved. Ha. And all the giant monsters were confined to their locales. But then aliens unleash a monster of their own. So all the monsters come forth, save the day, and then return to their islands. Another interesting entry in the series was All Monsters Attack, which had the premise of a lonely, bullied little boy who falls asleep and has a dream sequence. A dream of being on an adventure with the monsters, including Godzilla's son. And then when he wakes up from this dream, which is the movie, he has the courage to face the bad guys in real life.
Hi! なんだ、君か。何してんの？友達がいなくてつまんないや。じゃあ僕と同じだ。君何しに来たの？だってこの前ゴジラの背中に乗せてやるって言ったじゃないか。あ、そっか。今どこにいるかな？いつも一緒じゃないの？あんまりそばにいると怒るんだ。どうして？何でも一人で戦ってさ。一人で生きる練習しろって言うんだ。へえ、厳しいな。あ、8だ。行こう。
As we move into the 1970s, there was a bunch more versus movies in the series, featuring different monsters with simple plots that was basically just to facilitate a showdown. So it was basically just WWE at this point. And this all culminated in 1974 and 1975, where there was a two-part Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, followed by Terror of Mechagodzilla. And this is where he saves the world from a robot imposter, kind of like the Terminator, and his skin even gets blown off, showing his robotic skeleton underneath. So after a couple of decades, this was the last entry in the original continuity. Godzilla would take a break for the next decade, but King Kong, on the other hand, would return in 1976 with a remake. And of course, this had a completely different tone. This was going back to be a remake of the original Kong movie. And it basically followed a lot of the same story, except it was new and hip for the 1970s. And the young leads were so fresh and free-spirited and totally cringe.
Jack! Buy me a drink, will you? Come on. Come on. Buy me a drink.
Come on.
And instead of the Empire State Building, the conclusion was on the Twin Towers. And after this, both franchises were dormant for almost the next decade. Everybody was monstered out, apparently. But it returned in the mid-80s, 1984, The Return of Godzilla. This was a direct sequel to the original Godzilla movie. It ignored all the countless sequels that took place in the 60s and 70s. It tried to go back on the cheesy tone that had taken over, and part of those sequels was the lore of Godzilla being a protector. So that was no longer part of the story in this sequel. Instead, it was now again the nuclear menace. And the very cool part about this is that in the US, they had their own version, yet again, just like with the original, called Godzilla 1985, because it was released the year after.
Now, your favorite fire-breathing monster is back, like you've never seen him before. The legend is reborn in the all-new Godzilla 1985.
And, yet again, Raymond Burr reprised his role.
Who are you?
Name is Martin. You asked for me to be brought here.
Mr. Martin is the man you asked me to get, General. He's the newspaper man that witnessed Godzilla's attack 30 years ago.
Well, thank God you're here. Well, since you're the only person that seems to know anything about whatever it is we're dealing with, what can we do?
I was the only American who survived that catastrophe. If you men had seen what I saw, you'd realize that firepower of any kind or magnitude is not the answer.
And interestingly, his character name was Steve Martin, but there's no banjo playing involved. And then in 1986, by that point a decade had passed since the 70s King Kong remake, and they did a sequel to that remake. This was called King Kong Lives, and it had the bizarre plot twist that, despite dying at the end of the original, that he was kept on life support for 10 years and got an artificial heart transplant. And then Kong finally meets a female of his own kind. So there's no more pointlessly pining after humans like he did. They have a falling in love scene. Have a baby, but sadly King Kong dies. He can't catch a break. But at least he does get to bond with his son a little bit. And then, between 1989 and 1995, Toho made a bunch more Godzilla movies, and they reverted back to the 60s and 70s. Despite that 1984 film that tried to wipe the slate clean, they just went right back. A bunch of movies with Mothra, Mechagodzilla, and several others.
Godzilla 核爆発の危機。ゴジラを東京に近づけようというのか。本気でゴジラを倒す気があるならやるべきだ。
これがゴジラの最後の戦いになるかもしれない。
ゴジラ対デストロイヤー。
They had the awkward casting of English actors following Japanese directions, playing American stereotypes.
There's still a small group of Japanese soldiers holding out in the caves on the island, sir, but we should have them by morning.
The Stars and Stripes will fly over this island, too.
This is the last of the Marshall Islands. Next, we take the Marianas, sir.
This war might finally be coming to an end, Major.
I certainly hope so, sir.
Enemy plane, sir?
Impossible. No plane can fly that fast. That looked to me like it was from another planet.
I have to agree, sir. It did look like it was from another planet, but... Shall we report it, sir?
What, that we're being invaded by little green men from outer space? Let's just keep it as our secret. You can tell your son about it when he's born, Major Spielberg.
Sir, yes, sir! I will, sir.
There was also the lore revealed that Godzilla was a dinosaur affected by radiation. And oddly enough, of course this is a new separate continuity, but when Mechagodzilla returned, they called it Mechagodzilla 2, as if it's a sequel to the one from decades past, which of course it isn't. But that renaming was only done for overseas home video. They also brought back the character of Baby Godzilla. They had Godzilla himself die, and Baby Godzilla absorbed his atomic energy and became the new Godzilla. So that was it for that continuity, that series of the 80s and 90s. But then, in 1998, there was an American Godzilla film, simply titled Godzilla. Of course, it was standalone. It was meant to be part of a trilogy, but that idea was canceled after there was some backlash. Now, it's kind of funny to have any backlash because a lot of it was based on this premise of the Japanese series, understanding it, being superior and all that, which is kind of flimsy at best. They had already ran that series into the ground. They tried to go back to the spirit of the original once, and they didn't even stick with that. And maybe only due to the fact that it was so-called Americanized. And you know what? To have one movie out of dozens that is Americanized isn't a bad thing. It's an interesting thing. Shake it up once in a while. And it did follow the tropes of American movies of the time. The main hero, the character arc, just the general story pattern was pretty cut and paste from other blockbusters of the time. It even includes the 90s trope of mystifying computer speech. Of course, that doesn't hold water today, but it sure sounded good back then. Listen to this gem of a line.
The network is on an intranet. It's a direct feed into our computer system.
And it was also made to show off the CGI, which was in the stages of rapidly progressing at the time. It's not great by today's standards, but it still does the job. And it wasn't meant to replace the original Godzilla in any way. It was just a different take on it. Reinvention, reimagining in some areas. And speaking of American tropes, the very next month after this Godzilla remake, there was a King Kong remake that was bizarrely animated. I mean, this whole concept just seems weird. The Mighty Kong was a musical, and like any cartoon at the time, of course it had to be a musical, and it had to have a child character with an animal sidekick.
The Mighty Kong, the kid-friendly animated musical version of the classic story of King Kong. Kong escapes with the beautiful Ann Darrow and leads the police on a sensational chase, ending high atop the Empire State Building.
Put that girl down at once!
Featuring the voice talents of Dudley Moore and Jodie Benson, Disney's Little Mermaid.
She's sweet, dolly of the Polly Ollie.
Kids will go ape for the fun-filled songs by the Academy Award-winning songwriters of Mary Poppins, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Jungle Book, and the Aristocats.
I love it!
I'm gabbing too much and saying nothing. Why can't I clam up? I've never been this way.
This isn't like me. I'm never silent, completely tongue-tied, without a word to say.
I've never seen this girl before.
And King Kong doesn't die at the end, naturally. And then also later that year they had Godzilla, the animated series, which was based on the 1998 movie that ran for 2 seasons. It was about a surviving egg from the end of the movie that imprints on Matthew Broderick's character, and they fight various monsters around the world. So then, likely motivated by this TriStar American movie, Japan returned to making Godzilla films for another few years, starting with Godzilla 2000.
Godzilla!
Godzilla 2000. If you can't take the heat, run.
This was a reboot again, not the continuity from the 80s and 90s, and they would do one a year for the next 5 years. They would also bring back other various monsters like Mothra, Mechagodzilla, and others. However, they would also connect back to the original continuity that started in the 50s, and this brief series concluded with Godzilla Final Wars, which had action pieces set around the world, and even had appearances by numerous past characters, including the 1998 Godzilla. Yes, they made the American Godzilla a part of this continuity along with the other ones, and they retroactively named this character Zilla to differentiate him. So just in time for the 50th anniversary, they had this epic conclusion, and Godzilla and his son walk off into the sunset and takes a long break. So the franchise again went into storage. And in the meantime, in 2005, King Kong came back for another remake of the original, and this remake was made by Peter Jackson, and starring Jack Black as the main character. He did a good job, turned on, other than just what comes naturally to his persona, but he did drama when he had to.
Airplane's got him.
It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast.
This has the interesting concept of being a movie within a movie. Now, I don't mind long movies, but I felt this could have done better if it had a little more editing or deleted scenes involved. It was 3 hours plus. Some of it just felt like overblown spectacle that detracted from the good spectacle, and it definitely would have been solid if it was pruned down. A big part of that was the action pieces, which most I felt were over the top or dragged out. And some of them were just not even believable from a physics perspective. They just did not age well. But however, the last spectacle, the finale in New York, which took place in this version at sunrise, was absolutely stunning. Very stunning. With watching in 4K with surround sound. Jackson probably would have made it in 3D if he could, because he does like 3D. And he did take 3D pictures around the set with his personal camera. So in the middle of that decade, both franchises again take a break. But now we get to the Monsterverse, the major blockbuster shared universe that started in 2014. That was inspired first by Marvel to bring this concept back of a shared universe, and has been tried by many, succeeded at by few. So unlike past timelines that have rebooted the franchise and started fresh, but cut out all the entries in between except for the original, or maybe some of the originals, this new timeline starts completely from scratch, no connection to the 1954 film. It shows nuclear testing, attracting and energizing ancient creatures living underground where the radiation is higher. And they used to have power before humans, when radiation was supposedly stronger in the atmosphere. And this time, it's fully CGI Godzilla, no more rubber suit, but it's modeled after the general shape, the general look of the original Godzilla rubber suits, except now it's photorealistic and like a real creature. And, however, one aspect of the lore from the later Godzilla movies that they adopted for this remake was right off the bat, towards the end of the movie, to have everyone realize that Godzilla was their sort of savior. And while attempts in the past had been made to bring Godzilla to the screen in 3D, this had never come to fruition. The MonsterVerse started off right, and every theatrical entry has been 3D. And Godzilla had decent 3D. Nothing special, I would say, but it was decent. It interestingly took 3 years for them to release the next entry in this, what was to be a shared universe, with Kong Skull Island. Now, Kong Skull Island has consistently strong 3D. Even in mundane conversation, stylized, high visual effects scenes, does the 3D really shine, especially when it's combined with these vivid imagery and lots of layering. If you want to select your showcase 3D discs, I would say this is definitely could be one of them. So how about the movie itself? I mean, it's fun, it's interesting, it's a essential entry in the story that they're building. Is it an art film? I wouldn't go that far. It's got, of course, some fun actors in there that enhance the experience, but it also definitely has some stuff that just takes you out, like the noble savage trope, and they even make the explicit remarks about them, that there's no crime, no personal property, they're past all that. Yeah, that's not how humans work. Straight to the physically improbable stuff, like a woman lifting a helicopter and it actually moves. Stuff like that, I don't know, I can't. And then a couple years after that, there was Godzilla King of the Monsters. They reused that title. And this movie, personally, I enjoyed less, probably the least. It's less of a, seems to be less of an interesting standalone story as much as the others, and seems to be more like exposition for other movies. Like it doesn't have as much of an identity of its own. Like it sets up a lot of essential story elements that you'd need for the other movies, the continuing story, like the Hollow Earth theory and tying together other monsters like Mothra and Ghidorah, and tying all this into this organization called Monarch. And it has moments of strong 3D, but I wouldn't say any of it is really memorable or any standout inventive shots. It's sort of like in 3D because it's in 3D. And a lot of dark shots. Years after that, we had Godzilla vs. Kong, kind of a remake of that movie from decades ago. King Kong just gets more and more outlandish, the direction the franchise is going. I mean, not that that's a bad thing. Like, it starts with a scene of Kong, but it's effectively like he's in the Truman Show. And then we get to go into Hollow Earth, which is admittedly awesome. A little girl who can communicate with Kong, and possibly more, but we'll get to that later. And then there was a live-action TV show that was made for Apple TV. And this TV show was called Monarch: Legacy of Monsters, about this organization mentioned earlier that keeps track of these creatures called Titans. And it takes place over different decades, telling the story of these characters, and has Kurt Russell and also his son playing a younger version of himself. I had no idea that actor was his son. I was like, wow, how'd they get so fortunate? Somebody who looks and talks like him. It was uncanny, and then it makes perfect sense now.
Lieutenant Shaw, reporting as ordered. Sir?
Okay. It's over. It's over. It's over.
Colonel Shaw?
Here we go!
body in one piece back there. Run! Come on, get the rocks!
And speaking of 3D for this franchise, one rumor that had spread a little bit was that this TV show was going to be filmed in 3D so that it could also be released on the Apple Vision Pro headset. However, it's important to note that the producers of the show came out directly and addressed this rumor, and they said, quote, "It's just not true. I'm not sure how that got started. This show was shot in 4K and not designed to be viewed in 3D or upscaled to 3D. And by upscaled, I assume they mean to say converted. It would be cool. I also don't know how you would. But you're asking the wrong guys, apparently." But the point is, it's not a 3D show, never was. Now what's interesting is all this time that the MonsterVerse has been successfully releasing entries, Japan has continued to make some of their own Godzilla movies. However, it's not like before where they would reboot the continuity and make a few entries in that. Rather, they've made a handful of standalone entries that don't build on each other and basically try different things. Like in 2016, there was Shin Godzilla, another reimagining where he looked different. He had big eyes with no lids like a fish. He evolved. And then they did a animated trilogy for Netflix. Again, it's a cartoon. It takes place thousands of years in the future, and some humans are left. And then in 2023, there was Godzilla -1. This was probably the most successful of these standalone reimaginings. This one, interestingly, takes place in the 40s. It has a reinvention of a plot device from the very first movie, which was an oxygen destroyer.
また悪い夢。ご両親。
空襲でやられたようです。
兄さんも私と同じね。
親子ともども縁あってこうして引き取ったんだから。
だから私はどんなことがあっても死んではいけない。
銀座を襲ったあいつ。大島だ。ゴジラですよね。
あんなもん倒せっかありません。
東京がまた火の海になるのは見たくない。
戦争が終わってないんです。
今度の戦いは未来を生きるための戦いなんです。
However, that brings us to 2024, the latest entry in the main MonsterVerse. And the latest one was called Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire. I guess it's supposed to be said X. It's not versus, so this one is X, and I guess to not be a conflict, because in this one they're more so teaming up to help. They do fight a little bit, but they get help from another monster that's brought back Mothra, being their intermediary, talking some sense, however she communicates with them, especially Godzilla, because Kong's kind of on the right track. He can talk with the little girl. And speaking of that little girl, she gets to meet the members of her ancient culture who are in Hollow Earth and also help with the emergence of Mothra, which is important to the resolving the predicament they're in. Except there's no singing involved in this version. Meanwhile, Kong encounters some bad apes. And also, I guess we could call him, he's not really his son, but I mean, sure, we'll call him a new version of Son of Kong. I'd say the first half is weaker. A lot of the first half just felt a lot more lighthearted and no real, it's just all over the place. A little jokey at times. But then it really got into the story more and had more essential scenes that felt like it was actually fleshing out the story and progressing. And I'd say the second half of the movie was definitely the strongest. Because of the portals from Hollow Earth, there's also scenes all over the world, basically, at famous landmarks, which kind of get destroyed. Collateral damage, I guess. But the 3D is amazing. I saw it in IMAX 3D. Really strong depth. And I'd say the strongest depth is the CGI portions. I mean, you got medium to strong, solid conversion on all the live action footage, of course. And, of course, anytime there's green screen or layering. But the strongest 3D is definitely the computer animation. All these creatures in the virtual worlds, they didn't skimp on the 3D. It's powerful. And when it envelops your peripheral as well, that even enhances it. But regardless of what screen you're watching it on, the parallax is just objectively, measurably powerful. If you like 3D, you gotta see this in 3D. The unfortunate part is that who knows if it'll get a disc release, because WB has seemed to stop. Even with pre-existing franchises, like, for instance, the DC Universe, they haven't yet released a 3D Blu-ray for the latest 3D one, Aquaman 2, and also the Meg 1 and 2, both 3D, but the second one didn't get a 3D release. And they had been doing that even after other studios had stopped, even if it was only for online purchase. But likely a good chance this could get a release on the Apple Vision Pro. It's a possibility. But I won't talk too much about Apple Vision Pro. I'll save that for the next episode.